Well, thank you everyone for coming to our conference presentation panel today on political and social theory in Aquinas. Our first presenter is Loren Reinoso. He is a PhD candidate in political science at Yale University, and he works on reconciling political representation with theories of collective agency, as well as the history of representation theory in political thought. His presentation is entitled Aquinas' Theory of Political Representation.
Thank you all for coming. Good afternoon. And thank you, Evie, for chairing this panel. Today I have two goals in my presentation. The basic goal is to show that Aquinas offers a material for a theory of political representation. I'm going to explain the weaknesses in the most important historical account, that of Thomas Hobbes, and identify some examples of representation in Aquinas' work, and then try to explain how these will allow us to overcome the examples in Hobbes, the issues that Hobbes encounters. So first, just a broad definition of representation that Hobbes offers. He says that the person is to act or to represent himself or another, and he that acteth or another is said to bear his person or act in his name. So the idea of bearing a person is going to be really important when we come to Aquinas, because that's how we're going to know that Aquinas is talking about representation, not some other phenomenon. And so there's two problems that Hannah Pitkins identifies in Hobbes. Well, she identifies a lot more, but there's two salient ones. The first is that for Hobbes, representatives are unique. The people that are represented are uniquely responsible. Only they're committed to representatives' decisions, and only they're culpable if representatives act immorally. So he says that when the actor doth anything against the law of nature, or anything that's immoral, by command of the author, if he be obliged by form of covenant to obey him, not he, the representative, but the author, the represented, breaks the law of nature. For though the action be against the law of nature, it is not his, as in the representative's. And the second issue for Hobbes is that not only is a person who actually performs the literal action not accountable, morally irresponsible or accountable for the action, but there's also Hobbes also lacks what we can call a substantive content. So Hobbes can tell us why the represented person owns or authors the action because he authorized it, but he can't say, and so therefore bears the normative consequences. But Hobbes cannot say why he owns the action itself, why the represented person actually performs the action through the representative. And so Hobbes will say that some have their words and actions owned by those whom they represent, and the person that own it is the author. And he'll also say later that the representative bindeth the author no less than he had fitted made himself, and no less subjecteth him to him all the consequences the same. But there's a huge difference between telling someone they're responsible for what you do and that they actually do what you perform, right? So an employer might be vicariously responsible for the employee's conduct and might bear the responsibility for what the employee does, but does not thereby follow that the employer does whatever the employed person does, even though he's authorized to perform the action. For Aquinas, representation is a really important source for understanding his politics. And so there's one of my favorite quotes from Aquinas, which I'm going to start with, is that princes and prelates are to be honored despite being evil, insofar as they bear the person of God and the community over which they are placed. So here we're talking about the bearing of persons that Hobbes identifies as representation. And it's important this language does not begin with Aquinas. It actually is really old. It starts no later than Cicero. For example, he says that he bears the person of the city when he's talking about the minister, and that it is his duty to uphold its honor and dignity, enforce the law, dispense to all their constitutional rights, and remember that all this has been committed to him as a sacred trust. Augustine likewise talks about whether or not an executioner is morally responsible for murder, by saying that those who by the authority of God have waged wars, or bearing the person of public power, the personam grantis publicae potestas, have punished the wicked in death according to his laws. They're not thereby responsible for murder. And about a century before Aquinas' writing, John of Salisbury will talk twice in the Polycraticus, the first work of political theory in the Middle Ages, dedicated explicitly to political theory. He talks twice about a minister will bear the public persona, and if he remembers that, and he'll do his duty well if he remembers to bear the person of the whole community of his subjects. So Aquinas, if you recall, oops, I forgot to put the slide in, says that the prince bears the person both of God and of the community. And so what's interesting here is that it's a twofold act. So when he says that the prince represents God, he's here just talking about Catholic doctrine. So the Catechism itself will say, quote, citing Paul, those who are subject to authority should regard those in authority, namely in the political case, the government, as representatives of God who's made them stewards of his gifts. I'm not going to focus so much on what it means to represent God as what it means to represent the community here. And so what is important here is also that Aquinas will have this ordering of obligations. So it's first to God, then actually to your parents and your community, and then to the prince. So God holds first place in dignity. And second place is the principles of our being and government are our parents and our country. And belongs to piety in second place to give worship to one's parents and one's country, which includes our fellow compatriots. It's only after they give the duty of piety that we have the duty of observance, which belongs to the governor of a state in civil matters, and which for Aquinas will involve what would be a twofold obligation. First, it's about the excellence of position. So as the president of the United States or as a congressperson, we owe them a certain level of honor and respect. But then there's a question of how well they perform that office. And so in respect of excellence, there's recognition of, in respect of his excellence, the position of dignity itself, there is due to him honor, which is a recognition of his kind of excellence, and in respect of the excellence of his government, there's due to him worship consisting of in rendering him service. The idea being here that there's on the one hand the formal relation between the prince, who represents the community, and what the prince does. And so this is an institutional relation on the Thomas's model to take the distinction Pitkin makes in constant representation, which involves honor. And there's a substantive position which provides grounds to attribute the government's actions to the people, to exercise his government and worship and servants. And arguing that this is substantive content as present in Aquinas is going to be the focus of the rest of the talk. So Aquinas says that law, properly speaking, regards first and foremost the order to common good. And he says that to order the common good belongs either to the people of the whole or to someone who bears the office of the whole people, in other words, who represents them. The word here, grens vicem. And therefore, the making of a law, I didn't realize this, it wasn't working before, sorry. And therefore, the making of a law belongs either to the whole people or to a public personage who has care of the whole people. So in other words, the legislature is either the community as a whole or someone who represents them in the normal case. And he talks later in a really interesting discussion of political liberty and custom, or their custom exchange convention, that if the multitude be free and able to make their own laws, the consent of the whole people expressed by custom counts far more in favor of particular observance than does the authority of the prince, who has not the power to frame laws, except insofar as he bears the person of the multitude, in quantum gradit personam multitudinus. So what I take here is for Aquinas, what's happening is that if there's a custom by which that creates law, this custom also identifies who the ruler is and what the ruler does, and if we can ascribe the ruler's actions to the populace by saying that he, in performing his legislation, is acting in the people's name. And so this allows for both cases of law properly speaking, in which the law is just, in which their law is actually ordered for the common good and actually promotes the common good. But it also can apply to cases in which the people themselves believe that are willing to accept, well, they don't actually think the action is immoral, but they're willing to do things that are immoral, and they will ascribe those sorts of actions from the prince to himself. And so what we see here with Aquinas is that per Pseudo Dionysius, he distinguishes whose authority is done. So the idea here is that if the prince in the previous quote is bearing the legislative authority of the people, he's legislating through the people legislating through him in a free community. And the idea here, as Aquinas goes on, is according to Augustine, he slays not who owes his service to one who commands him, even if the sword is merely an instrument of him that wields it. And this quote from Augustine is directly preceding the quote that I brought up before, where he talks about if someone bears the person of the community of the public person and thereby executes God's command, is not responsible for murder. And so then Aquinas follows Augustine in continuing, wherefore those who at the Lord's command slew their neighbors and friends would seem not to have done it themselves, but rather he by whose authority they acted thus. Just as a soldier slays the foe by the authority of his sovereign, and the executioner slays the robber by the authority of the judge. The idea being here that if whoever bears the authority of the action, whoever authors the action, again, this is here Aquinas would agree with Hobbes, in some way is responsible for it. And so if it's the community that ultimately bears the legislative authority that the prince exercises, the community is responsible for the legislation, the community does legislate through the government. But in De Malo, Thomas also offers a somewhat different picture that allows us to allow ascription not merely of the action itself and not merely responsibility. So here the idea, the conversation and the question is whether or not we're all responsible for original sin and why it is that we have original sin, and there's a question of the community, and Adam and Eve is representing the community. And so what Aquinas says, that acts that are not done by individuals' own choice or by their very selves, by the whole community or by the majority of the community or by the rule of the community, belong to human beings as members of the community. Just so we say that the political community does what the rule of the community does. And So the idea being here that when the prince performs action A, so is the community. When the prince legislates a certain law, it's the community exercising its legislative power through the prince. It's not simply the community is responsible and bears the consequences and the guilt for an unjust law, for example, or conversely is praiseworthy for a just law that's passed by the prince. It's that the community itself really is exercising its authority through the government. And one corollary for this is that to a certain extent, if there's no authority to perform unjust actions, so if the community or if the individuals who authorize the prince authorize an action that's unjust, we can't put it on God. But there's also another core aspect here too, which is that the prince or the government ministers should know better. They should know they don't have the authority to act unjustly. And so Thomas, going back to the Summa, says that he that carries out the sentence of a judge who has condemned an innocent man, if the sentence contains an inexcusable error, he should not obey, else there be an excuse for the execution of martyrs. And here, there's some of the martyrs from the French Revolution. If, however, it contain no manifest injustice, he does not sin by carrying out the sentence, because he has no right to discuss the judgment of his superior, nor is it he who slays an innocent man, but the judge whose minister it is. So I think there's a three-place relation. There's God, there's community, and the people. If it's a unjust action, obviously execution, we obviously cannot say that God is executing the person, because God only acts justly. But now what happens when we're talking purely about the political relation between people and government? And the people want the government to act unjustly or to perform some sort of unjust action. In this case, we can say, I think, that the government, the officers, should ideally know if it's unjust or not. But there might be epistemological constraints. And when there are these epistemological constraints such that the government can't know whether the action is unjust, for example, a really complicated tax policy that really will affect those at the lower level, in those cases, we can't blame the government even though the action itself is unjust and culpable. We might not be able to blame the community either, and that's going to be a different question as well. The important question, there's an epistemological element here. And so this leads to a topology for Aquinas. Is the action just? If it's just, then it belongs exclusively to the represented person, the person who's authorizing it. So in this case, going back to the murder example that Aquinas and Augustine both have, if the person really is guilty of a crime, the executioner is not the person who's, properly speaking, killing the person, in a real important sense. He might be doing the bodily motion, but the action itself ultimately belongs to the community, and even more ultimately, if it's a just execution, belongs to God, who's punishing the murderer on this account. So we cannot blame the executioner for murder, because he didn't commit murder at all. But if the action isn't just, then the question is epistemological. Can the representative plead ignorance? If he can say it's not manifestly unjust, if he can provide some sort of excuse for his knowledge, or his lack thereof, then again, the action will belong exclusively to the person who orders the action. So, for example, a judge orders the execution of a man. The judge knows the man is innocent of the crime, he just doesn't like him. But the executioner might not know this. And so you can't say the executioner is responsible for murder because he's just carrying out the sentence, he's just exercising the virtue of obedience. If, however, the representative cannot plead ignorance, if, for example, the executioner and the judge both don't like the man, then the executioner can't just say, I'm following orders. He can't just pull an Eichmann. Well, he can, but if he does, he's wrong, because he's co-responsible. He himself did murder the man, just as the judge murdered the man. And so this brings us back to the problems of Hobbes that we identified earlier. So first, to recap, for Hobbes, only representees are ultimately responsible for their actions. For Hobbes, the executioner, because he's performing the command of the judge, gets off the hook. He doesn't like the man. He's representing him. It's the judge he's bearing the judge's person when he carries out the sentence. Or in the case of government, the government might just say, well, this is what we were elected to do. We were elected to perform, to institutionalize law XYZ that's grossly immoral. But you know what? That's what the people wanted when they elected us. And so it's really the people for Hobbes, or the judge, that's responsible for the action. Only they're culpable. But the executioner or the government officials who enact this unjust policy, they get off scot-free. Hobbes also lacks substantive content. He can't say that the representative owns the action's consequences. And it's unclear why. He can say the representative owns the action's consequences, right? That the people are responsible for the they're culpable for the legislation, the judge is culpable for the crime, but he also can. There's nothing in his theory that says why the judge actually literally killed the man. He's just responsible for murder. Aquinas' theory offers solutions, at least allows us to sketch out how solutions might be from the extracts of his work. So first, he does not think that represented persons are uniquely responsible. And there's a twofold question here. First, is the action just? As we saw, if the action is just, then responsibility belongs only to the person who's represented, because they're the one making ultimately the decision. Now, there's actually questions here about whether or not the representative does have a deliberative capacity, but I'm bracketing those for now because that's not something that Hobbes himself addresses, and I think Aquinas would allow for deliberation on the representative's part. And second, it depends on the representative's knowledge. So does the representative actually know that the action is unjust? If he does know, once again, he's responsible, his co-responsibility there. If he doesn't know, if he complete ignorance, then again, we should fall to the Hobbes position. But it's important that for Hobbes, this epistemological constraint does not obtain. The second is that Aquinas does offer substantive content. So the representative clearly owns the consequence of the action, but he participates in a really meaningful sense of representative action. Because on the Aquinas' model, simply by having authority over the action, you actually perform what is done. And for that reason, as he says, the community does what its representative does. And therefore, there's control over the action itself. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for that remarkably efficient and interesting presentation, Loren. Our second presenter is Len Ferry. Let me bring up his presentation here. Here we go. Okay, this will work with that. Okay, great. So Len Ferry teaches at a Canadian two-year community college in the Department of Liberal and Academic Studies. His primary research is in political philosophy, with a focus on theories of political obligation and the natural law. He has published work on Aquinas' political theory, ethics, and the philosophy of emotions in the Haythrop Journal, New Blackfriars, Proceedings of the ACPA, and Maritain Studies. He is currently web and social media editor for the Canadian Jacques Maritain Association, so reach out to him if you want to get involved with that. The title of his presentation is Consent by Any Other Name, or Was Aquinas a Consent Theorist?
Okay, I hope this is okay. Sorry. So let me begin by a bit of a preface here. This is part of a larger project. The larger project will look at hierarchy in Aquinas as well as virtue, but I'm going to bracket that for now. So this is my way of apologizing to Mark Murphy, who's going to come in for some heavy weather today. But I think there's a lot of valuable stuff in his work. I'm just not going to focus on that today. So the point of contention dates back quite a ways to an article in the 80s, and then another one in the 90s, and then some more recent work. The first one by Samuel Beer, who concludes, for more than 2,000 years, nearly all leading minds had rejected popular government. Classical philosophy had taught the rule of the wise, Christian theology, the rule of the holy. Medieval thinkers had combined the two ideas, vesting authority in a hierarchy of natural virtue and a hierarchy of divine ordination. So I'm going to leave some of that to the side, but the question is, for me in this paper, whether or not we have a way of grounding political obligation in Aquinas through the notion of consent. Murphy is going to argue against Beer that we do. I'm going to suggest that we don't. Sorry. So for Beer, this means no consent of the governed to political authority, so that's gone as an idea, and no democratic organization in terms of regime type. Murphy, in responding, not this time specifically to beer, this is later on, it is bad history to set up natural law and consent theories of political authority as unqualifiedly antagonistic to each other. But it is not an unfair description of the accounts of political authority offered by contemporary natural law theorists to say that these accounts were developed in self-conscious opposition to voluntaristic accounts of political obligation, and that their formulations rule out as normatively unnecessary a citizen's consent to adhere to the dictates of the civil authority or civil law. If we are blinded by the bad history, we might think it altogether natural or obvious that a contemporary natural law view would eschew any basic appeal to consent. The emphasis there, by the way, is all mine. So I agree that there is a fair amount of bad history. I agree that Beer engages in some bad history in his essay, yet I disagree about valorizing, and maybe that's too strong, so at least redeeming consent theory from within the natural law theory of Aquinas. Quoting Johannes Messner, there is agreement in the traditional natural law doctrine that political authority, since it is part of the moral order, has its origin in God. I think this is part of that story that Murphy is concerned about, traditional natural law thinkers telling a story where consent isn't going to play the role that he wants it to play. I'm lining myself up with Messner and others. In doing so, I think Aquinas is not our contemporary. I'm going to give a reason at the end for thinking that's a good thing. But I think he's not our contemporary, and we shouldn't wish for him to be so with respect to consent theory and political obligation. He doesn't offer us a consent theory that would satisfy contemporary accounts of political authority. Aquinas, that is, would also be opposed to voluntaristic accounts, and consent is normatively unnecessary in his account. So if we go back to the previous slide where Murphy thought it was necessary, I don't think it is. He gives us some good reasons to be cautious about thinking of authority as being grounded in the consent of the governed, in fact. So just to flesh out Messner's thought on this, natural law doctrine of popular sovereignty, it's not that consent plays no role, and I'm also going to admit that consent plays a role in Aquinas. What it doesn't do is ground political obligation. Political authority is not a consequence of or a mandate of the people. Political authority is rooted in the natural order of the political community, an order required for human perfection. Obedience is commanded by the natural moral order, and exercise of political authority cannot be annulled by the people. I'm going to come back to consent near the end. So modern consent theories, you can start with Hobbes. Locke is probably a better candidate here. Political authority is mandated by the popular will. The authority of the state is rooted in the consent of the governed. In its exercise, it is strictly to be understood as representing the people. Obedience is owed in some sense to ourselves. To the extent that it is dependent on, it is also subject to revocation by the popular will. Okay, so here's my picture of Aquinas. Now this isn't fully accurate, and we'd get influences later in the 16th and 17th century from Suarez and Bellarmine, so we can add in the transmission or translation theory if you'd like, but for now we'll keep it clean. The natural moral order traces itself back to God, and political authority itself is traced back through the natural moral order to God. No consent necessary. Where consent can and does play a role, it can help us determine who rules and what type of rule or what type of regime. Again, with modern consent theory, and maybe this is something worth keeping in mind when I come back to it and say, hey, we shouldn't get too friendly here. Political authority, who rules, and what type of regime all come back to the atomistic individual. Just a quick survey of the field here so that I don't sound like a contrarian Canadian for no reason. To consent and the role it played in lawmaking, governmental practice, and the making of kings, Aquinas alludes, but preoccupied in Aristotelian fashion as he was, with final rather than efficient causality, he does so only in passing and without notably clarifying what he takes to be the precise nature of the consent involved. quoting Oakley. And he thinks this is especially true of Aquinas, that really, for those who are really keen on trying to trace consent theory back to Aquinas, you're going to struggle. I actually think we don't want to. Casual talk about the medieval contribution to the emergence of the modern notion of legitimating political authority via the consent of the governed tends to lapse into a confusing cat's cradle of anachronism. I didn't actually know what a cat's cradle was, so I had to look this up despite the white hair. So it's one of those odd things that you do with string on your hands, and then you try to pass that off to somebody else. And I think Oakley is probably right on that one. The modern theory of legitimation by consent, Oakley says, rejects meritocratic rule, the common good, and or political naturalism for the freely giving consent of the governed. And of course, Aquinas thinks, I'm going to argue elsewhere, but thinks meritocratic rule is not a bad idea. As we've already heard, thinks the common good is really important. I would put reason above the common good, but thinks the common good is really important. And from his Aristotelian interests, has a conception of political naturalism, the natural moral order being traced back to God. Modern theory also rejects consent conceived as a collective act of the political community for a concatenation of discrete acts of autonomous individuals. And finally, grounds political obligation of the subject or citizen in the realm not of final causality, but of efficient, not in the ends that governments exist to promote, but in the source from which they derive their powers. That source is the self-assumed obligation of individual agents. Murphy's argument in 2 lines of critique. So I'm simplifying a bit here, but I'm trying to pick out the major steps or the major moments in his critique of beer. With most of that, I actually agree, but I'm trying to draw attention to something I disagree with. So step 1, demonstrate that the ground or source of political authority is the law of nations. Step 2, argue that the law of nations is underdetermined, that is, that it needs to be determined. Step 3, claim that custom is, A, rooted in the consent of the people, and now here's the magic. Step 3b provides the relevant and sufficient determination of the law of nations to ground political authority, so that if consent gets in through custom, it then through custom gets back in through the law of nations. So the conclusion, Aquinas has a consent theory of political authority. That's Murphy's conclusion. I think it behooves us to deny both step 1 and step 3, and that's both parts of step 3. I think it's just, the jus gentium is itself a cat's cradle, and I'll say a little bit about that, but I'm not sure it does exactly what Murphy needs it to do, and then I'm particularly concerned with custom, so I'll end with custom. So just a few conceptual clarifications, because I think one of the things that goes wrong for Murphy is that he allows some of these concepts to be elided, but we have a very rich tradition, and here I'm drawing on Maritain and Simone primarily, a very rich tradition of sorting out these concepts when it relates to political authority and political obligation. So political authority itself, I want to say, is a moral right to govern, and correlative with that are the obligations to obey among those who are so governed in a political community. I want to distinguish that authority, because I'm going to say it derives from the natural law, from consent-based theories of authority. Consent itself is freely given by individuals, modeled on the generation of moral obligations in acts of promising. I mean, that tends to be the primary model for most consent theories. They're transactional. I have to voluntarily do something in order to consent. Harry Barron, in his membership model of consent theory, calls these acts self-assumed obligations. I have to take them on myself. Distinct governing personnel. Who actually rules? So who rules, which is not a question of whether or not they have the right to govern. So right to govern, I want to say, is an issue for political authority. Determining who is the distinct governing personnel is a different matter altogether. And there, I think consent can play a role. It does by voting, in a sense. The choice of the governing personnel. And partly, I want to draw attention to this distinction because without this distinction, we might, trip ourselves up, and I think that's what happens with Murphy in terms of tripping himself up, because we can have a community without a distinct governing personnel. We can actually have a community, it would have to be incredibly small, but where everyone participates, and in that community we would still need political authority to govern relations. We could even go so far as to say, look, in a community of angels, we're still going to need, for Aquinas, authority. He says it explicitly. We need authority to govern in such a community itself, and the angels aren't bad guys. So if we need it there, we need this distinction to help us differentiate. Okay, and then finally, regimes themselves. So these are the types of political organization. And again, just like I think, hey, maybe consent could play a role in determining who the distinct governing personnel are, they could also play a role in determining the type of regime within a community. So the types of political organization that determine the distribution of power, rights, responsibilities through institutions and practices. And then one last, and I'm trying to clarify distinctions, but this one I'm going to cheat a little on because it's not that clear to me either, but I think it's important, and that is the difference between authority and law, because oftentimes we get tripped up into thinking about law. So we talk about our obligation to obey the law. I mean, there are so many anthologies of essays on our obligation to obey the law. With all due respect to John Finnis, he talks about our obligation to obey the law when he's drawing on work from Simone, but Simone himself distinguishes between law and authority and argues that the closer that law approaches its true self, it becomes more universal, and the more universal is actually tying itself into the natural moral order. We don't need authority there. Where we need authority is in the moment where I've got to make a prudential judgment about what's good for my community here, now, and I don't have time to wait. I've got to issue a dictate today and decide either we're going to war or we're not, or we're responding to this attack or we're not. That's where I need political authority, and there I'm enmeshed in, I'm up to my hip waders in particularity. So one last distinction that I think is important as we try to clarify conceptions here, or concepts. Murphy rightly faults Beer for conflating 3, specifically on whether they must be wise and holy, and 4, on how rulers come to rule within different political orders. But he seems to think the procedure in 4 provides the grounds for 1. And that's where I think, wait a minute, we could see consent in 3 and 4, but I don't want consent in 1 because I just don't think it's there in Aquinas. I also think it's not good for political communities. So political authority as part of the conscience principle. I'm just going to quickly go through this slide. Divine precepts clearly have obligatory force. Quoting from the De Veritate, since conscience is nothing else but the application of knowledge to an act, it is obvious that conscience is said to bind by the power of a divine precept. Political authority issues commands and directives. Where does the obligatory force for these arise? Murphy's argument is that, in part, consent via customary law plays that role. I don't think that that works. I'll skip that longer question because I want to get to step 1, and then I've got a cheat for step 2, so we should be able to stay on track for time. So Murphy focuses on the law of nations at first, that's step 1, and claims that it provides the procedure by which rulers come to power. So the law of nations grounds political authority. Now, I mentioned that this is a bit of a cat's cradle. I mean, there are worse terms to try to sort out in Aquinas. The phrase itself, jus gentium, not other like jure, but just jus gentium itself occurs 19 times in the works, but 17 of those appearances are in the Summa Theologica, and 2 of them in 2 questions, 2 articles. So actually fairly narrow band. The part that Murphy wants to draw our attention to is the relation that Aquinas draws when he's talking about in 95.4, the relation between natural law and positive law, and then dividing positive law. Now, Aquinas just has a lot of work to do because he's got a lot of theorists. He's got to try to make sense with each other. So he's got Ulpian, he's got Gaius, he's got a whole bunch, and they say different things about what law is, and it's like, how do I make this make sense? So he's got to introduce a bunch of distinctions to try to make this make sense. And one of the distinctions that he introduces is the law of nations and civil law. And he relates those by analogy to the deductions and determinations of the natural law. So law of nations are like deductions, conclusions drawn from premises, and civil law like determinations by way of particular determination. So I don't know that the procedural account that Murphy tries to squeeze what Aquinas is doing into actually works, but what I do know is that it doesn't ground political authority in general. That isn't, like, he doesn't use the law of nations in any of these occurrences to say, hey, this is how I'm grounding political authority. Now, what Aquinas means, I'm quoting Murphy here, what Aquinas means by saying that political authority exists by the law of nations, then, is that it is such a straightforward implication of the natural law that political authority be instituted and exercised, that such institutions of governance are features of almost every known human community. For the natural law dictates not only that each of us pursue his or her particular good, but also that we promote the common good of our communities. But the institution and exercise of political authority are necessary for the achievement of the common good. Thus, political authority is of the law of nations. I think political authority, if we read this carefully and try to tease out some of those conceptual clarifications earlier, is actually of the natural moral law. And I think Murphy says it here, but then he draws this strange conclusion that it's actually of the law of nations. So I think Aquinas' position is that the binding power of political authority is of the natural law. If that is right, then what role is there for consent? Again, as I mentioned earlier, maybe in the DGP and maybe in regime type. Okay, so that's my take on step one. How do we get rid of step two? Or sorry, step three, and without the two bookends of the argument I think falls apart. This is where I'm going to cheat because I'm down to 1 minute. So if you want to know the answer to that, you got to read my paper. But what I want to say, and this is going to be a little cheeky, and I apologize, you can just blame it on a Canadian, but Murphy does what I think you did. He quotes part of Aquinas on the custom, but Aquinas goes on to say, wait for it, because by allowing the community to live that way, I mean, this is straight out of Shakespeare, right? We've got measure for measure here. By allowing the community to live that way, it's like I've approved as the ruler. So it's not the community that is the fundamental source of obligation. It's, hey, I'm letting you do this, and by turning a blind eye, that comes back on me at some point in time. Okay, the rest comes out in the paper. I do have some other reasons for thinking that we want to be careful when it comes to consent, but I'm going to conclude with Simone, since I'm talking about authority. And it's like, be careful what you wish for. If we really had a consent theory in Aquinas, I think we'd be unhappy with it, because I think we have a better theory of authority in Aquinas than consent. Authority and obedience are destroyed, indeed, by the determination not to obey a law unless one has consented to it. They are destroyed by the theory that government is like a cab driver whose duty is to take me where I want to go and by the ways of my own choice. So the two last points there, I just want to draw out what Simone is saying. I determine the ends of government. I determine the way it works. And if I don't like it, I say goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you, Len. If you have a shoelace, I can demonstrate later how to make a cat's cradle. I have experience with that. Just a moment, we'll get the last presentation up here. Okay. So our final presenter is Jermaine Mackenzie, who is also from Canada. He is a Peruvian-Canadian theologian and sociologist who earned a PhD in religion and culture from CUA. His academic interests focused on the intersection of Catholic theology and sociology. He is currently studying the preconditions for a dialogue between theology and the social sciences that would respect the nature and method of each of those disciplines. He also studies new evangelization initiatives in Canada using quantitative and qualitative sociological approaches. He is currently Associate Professor of Sociology and Theology at St. Mark's College in Vancouver, and will present today on Thomistic Personalism and Social Theory, reinterpreting what social structures are and do.
Thank you very much. I can use this one. I think this is better. Thank you, everybody, for being here. The notions of structures or systems have been used in some philosophical schools and quite widely in the sciences. Sometimes the distinction between the two uses has become blurred. Among the former, one might cite the philosophical uses of structures or systems. One might cite Kantianism, structuralism, post-structuralism, postmodernist thought, Marxism, neo-Marxism, and what today passes as critical theory. Among the sciences, those who have used or usually make use of this concept of structure or systems are psychoanalysis, ecology, cultural studies, sociology, among many others. Such concepts postulate that besides factors that intervene in our ordinary lives, of which we are conscious and with which we deliberately respond, there are other forces hidden and overarching, which also exercise powerful immediate causality on us. Often, so it is said, we are unaware of their existence, sometimes going so far as to deny their existence altogether. Furthermore, it is not unusual that a structure-based analysis is easily related with ethical demands in a narrative of enlightenment and liberation. The idea of social structure is among the more important concepts in sociology, if not the most important. The ways in which it has evolved in the discipline has widely impacted popular culture. And notions such as racism, sexism, classism, xenophobia, patriarchy, heteronormativity, colonialism, etc., are used to name specific, often negative social structures, allegedly operative in a specific social context. However, a clearer understanding of what they are and of interplay between social structures and human agency has been only developed in relatively recent times. The connection between these analytical devices and postmodernist ethics of celebration of diversity and promotion of inclusiveness has allowed for the powerful dissemination of an ethical project in the West and beyond. So given the importance of a topic then and the relatively scarce analysis on it from within the Catholic tradition, I think the issues studied in this paper might be pertinent. So in what follows, I'm going to explore a Thomistic personalist approach to social structure, and I will look into the thought of Aquinas, obviously, but also Maritain, Clark, and Wojtyła. I would also want to mention that as a first point, right, that Jacques Maritain sees modern science and sociology with it as a science of observation. It is in an experimental and mathematized framework that it works, and by doing so, it looks for essences as they are hidden in concrete beings without being able to find the intelligible need immanent to their objects. It is an inductive kind of science which takes us not to necessary causes, but to causes, between quotation marks, which action is predicated by the perceived sensible effects that serve as a sign of their presence. In contrast with this view of modern science, philosophy and mathematics are science of explanation, which directly apprehend substantial essences through the proper accidents. It is Maritain's idea that philosophy, especially philosophy of nature, benefits from its interaction with modern science, when the latter offers the former with facts that remain solid despite the changes in scientific theories. On the other hand, modern science benefits from philosophy in as much metaphysics determines the nature and worth of the knowledge of empirical science and protects the latter from the formations coming from wrong philosophical assumptions. So this is just to kind of clarify sociology from the Thomistic standpoint, right? And then to be able to go ahead with my exercise. So this piece has 3 parts. It narrows a topic and concentrates only on the nature of social structures and the processes by which they originate. And the strategy I want to follow is to actually cite Christian Smith's definition of social structure, which I find one of the most insightful one, the broadest one, and actually one that is very much attuned with Thomistic understanding of science in the world, because Smith works in the frame of critical realism, and critical realism actually is a realist position, as is evident from the name, and accept causations and finality. So Smith, who actually works here, he's not a Thomist, but he works under this paradigm, which is closely connected, it can be connected in a relatively easy way with a Thomistic personalistic approach. That's why I also chose his definition of social structure. So this is what he says about what a social structure is. For him, there are durable patterns of social interactions constituted by A, shared self-interpretations, and B, practices that have ethical legitimation, express themselves in material objects, and put pressure on us to conform to them. To give an example so we could actually illustrate this kind of juicy definition, right? If we think of our political system, the liberal democracy, right? Of course, it is characterized by a set of patterns of social interaction that are durable, that the system produces in time. And these interactions are kind of made up, if you want, of 2 elements that come together. Some ideas of who we are as a people, some ideas of what are political rights, some ideas about how we should elect political authorities, some ideas about how we should keep them accountable. That's one thing. Ideas about groups, about political authority in itself, about the people on the other hand. All these ideas are shared by those who are involved in the structure. And secondly, a set of practices by which we abide in these ideas explained. For example, every time we have elections, we go and vote. For example, when our representative comes to hear what their constituents want, we go and tell them what do we want. For example, when we keep those in power accountable. All those are practices that are embedded with ideas I just described. So according to Smith, the coming together of these ideas and practices, particularly his interpretation about who we are as groups and individuals, and these practices, is what creates social structures. I just have given you the example of political system. I could have given you an example of any kind of social system. The political system is a formal system, but there are many informal social systems as well, right? So we construct these systems, as Smith would say, and we reproduce them because, first, they make our life orderly and predictable. And secondly, because they help us to deal with the interplay between human needs and interests on the one hand, and scarcity and competition on the other. Because regardless of the fact that we all have the same drive towards flourishing as human beings, the reality is that the goods that we're after are not evenly distributed among us. And some of them are scarce. So in order to avoid in order to order how this kind of inequality or this kind of lack of access might affect the whole of people, then we create social structures, right? So in what follows, just to mention, structures create hierarchies per definition, and as a consequence, they create inequality. There's no way around this. In what follows, we will focus on points 1, 2, 3, and 6 of this definition. So what is my strategy? What strategy I want to actually take? I want to look at Smith's definition of social structure and then ask if a Thomistic personalist account has the insight, the conceptual, I would say, tools, if you want to put it that way, to actually reinterpret this definition in its own terms, right? So this has is a flip side of this. There's a flip side to this approach, which is I cannot actually propose a fully fledged Thomistic account of this issue because I am beginning with a definition that it comes from elsewhere, not from the Thomistic tradition in itself, right? But as an exploratory kind of essay, I thought it was a good idea to take this route. So in what follows, I will simply explain 3 points that I think illustrate how Thomistic personalism can interpret basic characteristics of this definition. So the first point has to do with durable patterns of human interaction. Smith considers social structures as these durable patterns of social interaction. What originates these patterns is the interplay between human needs and interests on the one hand, and the world in which we live on the other, characterized by scarcity and competition. Smith believed that the creation of social structures respond to the need for overcoming the tension between human needs and scarcity, of settling dysfunctional and unjust ways of providing for needs and interests. For example, a free market economy would be a formal structure in which the competition for obtaining scarce economic goods could find a place to occur in an open, well-informed, and balanced manner. This arrangement would, in principle, avoid dysfunctionality of over or underproduction and prevent certain injustices, such as higher prices or due to monopolies. For Clarke, on the other hand, each finite being is composed of its essence and the act of being, esse. However, the activity of esse does not end in bringing an essence into reality, but entails ongoing activity aimed at bringing individual essence near to its full completion at all moments. Hence, the act of being cannot be seen as a state, but as a dynamic impulse and energy, a restless force carrying each being forward, working the depth of its own reality into a full self-achievement. Human persons share these characteristics in an eminent way. They are particularly self-expressive, self-communicative, and relational because they possess intellect and will, which makes humans self-conscious and self-determining. The unfolding of this dynamism entails looking after a satisfaction of specific human needs, which are to be met through the pursuit of certain goals. Aquinas has his own characterization of what these basic human goals are, so I will not go again and talk about that. This philosophical approach, just mentioned by Clarke, however, is only realized by every finite thing, and hence by every human person, within several constraints. There are constraints from within us. To begin with, if what's going to fulfill us would be, let's say, the contemplation of truth, our limitation as finite beings for contemplating God as an infinite truth, then is one of the first limitations we face. And along with that one, many other limitations that come from within. You may lose yourself. But however, there are limitations that come from without the person in order to achieve these goals we are looking for. We should mention the constraints placed upon us by our location in society and culture. Access to goods that are scarce and for which human beings compete against each other are not equally offered by societies and cultures around the world, which try to make up for their limited number. Even within a given society and culture, members face unequal access to economic goods, mechanisms of political participation, education and health services, resources for social recognition, scientific and technological sources, moral insight and wisdom, etc. So all those are limitations we face, and anthropology and sociology actually focus on how these structures we create help us to deal with this scarcity and limitation. And at this point, we may ask whether Aquinas' thought helps us to determine if social structures are created by human beings as means for overcoming such disjunction. And I think that the best place to look into the answer for the question is in Aquinas' theory of the state, authority, and the law. I will not repeat this theory because in part has been referred to by my colleagues now, and I'm sure you know the basics of that. However, the concept we can draw is that Aquinas' understanding of the political system conveys an implicit view of social structure as durable patterns of human interaction, which are established through the interplay of human needs and the scarcity of some goods that we are after, and the subsequent competition of people. Such political social structure allows for the mitigation of conflict and the avoidance of mutual extermination, and offers the possibility to allow all members of society as much as possible to have access to some of the goods by which human persons will grow closer to fully achieving their self-realization. This social structure defines, patterns, organizes, and regulates political life, makes distinctions between groups, which necessarily entails inequality, and at the same time create a common standard by which differences become meaningful. So that's my first point. I am basically saying that Aquinas' view of the political system already can be interpreted or seen as very much aligned with what, in Smith's mind, social structures are a durable pattern of social interactions. We could also think of other aspects of Thomistic thought, and I would say we could find similar results, right? Or at least some results in terms of this comparison. How much time do I have?
5 minutes.
Okay. I will briefly speak about sections B and C. I will stop after that. So another characteristic of social structures is that they are based on this coming together of shared self-interpretations, interpretations of groups, as well as practices, and all this, it becomes habits. And for doing this, I'm going to basically cite again Clarke when he says that relationality is so important in the life of each human person, because he believes that the whole life of a human person revolves around the polarity of substantiality and relationality, the inward-facing act of existential presence in itself, and the outward-facing act of self-expression and self-manifestation by others. Each person experiences that at the beginning of her existence. As a child, her sense of personhood, of being an I, only develops in relationship to a thou, or to her mother or her surrogate. In time, we also come to realize that we inhabit a web of relationship with others, each of them a thou who treats us as a subject, a network different from that which we establish with things as its. That's what Clarke so far. So, in other words, in Clarke's framework, we, human person, appears to both having an ontological consistency as an embodied soul with a concrete biological makeup and a characteristic psychological structure or personality, intellectual and evolutional capacities. However, her identity, understood as her sense of the self, also comprises accidental elements that are related to her social roles. For example, being a citizen, an entrepreneur, a professor, a father, and to the social groups into which she belongs. For example, being a newly arrived immigrant, a Latino, white, male, etc. This second group of accidental elements that have to do with roles and groups, social groups I mean, is amenable to various interpretations depending on the meanings associated with them in particular cultures. Human persons' actions are strongly influenced by the possession of a complex sense of self. While interacting with each other, we create networks with whom we create shared self-interpretations of ourselves as belonging to a family, neighborhood, town, city, region, and nation. Some interpretations of that kind pertain to social roles, whereas others pertain to social groups. All these interpretations take the form of stories and discourse and occur within an ethical framework. To such shared self-interpretations, and we add shared practices, the two of them creating patterns of social interactions. Both interpretations and interactions, social interactions, in practical social interactions, retain a circular relationship among them by which one gives meaning to the other and the practices legitimate interpretations. So our belonging to different groups and the roles we play appear to us are natural and habitual. So how is this possible, this inner life possible? It is possible, and here I will briefly summarize my argument here, is that it's possible because our inner life is constituted by habit, not only of the mind and of the will, which Aquinas clearly speaks about, but only habits of the affections and emotions, and even habits of the body. I will skip some reference to Maritain's idea of how is this possible. Maritain has some reference to a pre-conscious life of the soul. So I mean. Meaning he recognized that there's a tacit set of habits at work in our inner life that also, I argue, explain this, this fact, right? The fact that we entertain self-interpretations about who we are, how do we belong to other groups, and how this all fits together. I have only 1 minute, and it's impossible for me to actually refer to this last point, but I will only say this. Maybe we can discuss this in one question. There's a third issue with social structure, which has to do with what is called downward causation. And here, I am using here the terms of causation as modern science uses, not in the metaphysical sense. This is not other than, let's say, in social structure put pressure on us, so we abide by them. They ask us to conform. And if we conform, we get some kind of prize or reward. If we don't conform, we actually pay a price. For example, if I want to marry someone who is below my social class, depending on the society, right? I can't speak about my own experience, then I might face trouble with my family or close friends because I am breaking some expectations, which are at least to marry with someone with my same social class or above. And that's what is called this kind of downward causation, this conditioning effect social structures have. So the question about what is the metaphysical status or of social structures is a very important one. What kind of things are these? What kind of realities are these that actually are accidental to us, but put pressure on us so we should conform? And for explaining this, I'm basically going to say that I am relying on, again, on Norris Clarke's idea of the need for a new accident, which he calls system. So he says, well, you know, the 10 categories Aristotle spoke about and Thomas Aquinas took, they need to be supplemented by a new one. And this category is called system. What is system for him? It's a new mode of unity existing between and binding together individual substances, which is not merely the sum of many different accidental relations, but forms a new unity with its own properties that is not reducibly merely to the sum of all in the individual relations, but is a new mode of unity that resides in all the members at once. In other words, this will be my last idea, for Clarke, there is some kind of accident, that there are special accidents, that they obviously inhere in substances as any accidents do, but they connect all those substances that have the same accident. In this case, for example, being middle class, being upper class, being of this race or this other race, being of this sex or whatever, they connect them in a certain way. So they actually form a unity, and this unity puts pressure on the members of the system. It's not then a substantial property. It's an accident inherent in these substances, but that creates a new mode of being. I am just paraphrasing Clarke. So I stop here, and I hope that was interesting to you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, all three of you. We have some time for Q&A now. I'll just very quickly say, I introduce myself. So my name is Behling. I'm a doctoral candidate here in political theory, and I'm working on the parts of Aristotle's Politics that Thomas was wise enough to stop before he read a commentary on. So anyway, we'll start with Professor Philpott.
So excellent presentations, fascinated with them all. I wanted to ask a question about Loren's arguments about representation, and argue about the question about the relationship between kind of individual responsibility and corporate responsibility, namely when somebody in the political realm acts in the name of the political realm. It could be something that a political leader does, or maybe a person wearing uniform, or something like this. And the distinction that I wanted to put forth comes from the question of public apologies for political leaders who are apologizing for something that happened in the past that another person committed that was the head of the same organization. Like John Paul II, for instance, apologized for Catholic Church, things that others had done in history. I mean, German leaders apologized for the Nazi past and so forth. But the question is always like, what gives them the standing to do that, right? And I think the answer might be that when somebody commits a wrong in the name of the political order, there's a twofold sense. One is a sense in which that person is doing something wrong, in which that person is only culpable for his or her own actions. They might be judged for that, or that is their moral responsibility. But there's a second sense in which they act in the name of the order as a whole. And in that sense, it's the order as a whole, in some sense, committing the wrong, such that today a Japanese American could receive reparations from the U.S. government for what Roosevelt did, or a leader of Germany could apologize for the Nazis and so forth. But the point is that you could have a kind of, when somebody does something, commits an action, it could be there's both a collective dimension and an individual responsibility dimension. They kind of spin on different axes. And what would be your response to that in light of your argument?
Yeah, great question. So actually, I wouldn't even go. So before I even begin with that, I think there's apologies, and then there's actual sometimes more material things that are also done as well. You mentioned reparations as well, and those are two different but really closely related. So I'll have to address both of them in turn. First, I think one of the issues with Hobbes is that he doesn't allow for this idea of this twofold responsibility. Either the sovereign is acting unjustly, in which case, he can't act unjustly because injustice requires the state, in which case, and this is Pickens' point, the sovereign just gets off the hook for doing terrible things, or it's the people that are fully responsible. For Aquinas, if it's an unjust action, as I read him at least, and I know this might be controversial, if the ruler if it's not manifestly unjust, the responsibility all falls on the community, right? So, but in the case you're talking about, it's manifestly unjust. For example, Korematsu decision and interning Japanese Americans because they're Japanese, or persecuting Jews in the Holocaust, or one of my favorite examples is the United States removed Bikinians from Bikini Atoll to test nuclear bombs, which is there's no justification for that whatsoever because it's an evil project, right? And in each of these cases, there's an apology owed, and there's reparations that might be owed as well. Okay, so there's two things. One is that to take reparations, for even putting the apology aside, why does the United States owe reparations to Bikinians or Japanese Americans that were interned, or their descendants that were interned, or Germany owe to victims of the Holocaust, and so on and so forth? Well, part of this is actually I'm literally I just started reading a book on this too, which the fundamental has a real. So Evie Pasternak has a distinction between there's distributive effect of reparative obligations, such that in effect, the Japanese Americans who are being repaid are also contributing through their tax dollars to the money that's being given to them. So it falls on the entire community to a certain extent. And so the community is now on the hook for this because we've authorized the government to act intra vires, to act in our name, and on the reading of Aquinas, I have this custom. We have a custom of attributing these sorts of actions to us. With apologies, it's the same deal, except it's also reparative in a sense, but it doesn't have a material component in the sense that you're not, for example, someone who's interned, for example, loses wages, they lose their jobs. Now it's trying to rectify the relationship and say, you know what, we can't fix what we've done before, but we can try to do better moving forward and right our relationship with you. I think it's the community has, in the same way the community doesn't have the authority to intern Japanese Americans or displaced Bikinians or whatever example is, it does, however, have the authority to fix its wrongs. And so the authority that the representative will be enacting there is an authority to bind oneself to the consequence of actions, including reparative obligations. How that actually works is part of my dissertation, and so I can't fully catch that out right now, but I hope that's a sketch of an answer that starts to address your concern.
Gentleman in the red tie.
So I'm going to go to Professor Ferry's paper. That was really interesting to try to think through this, and I think I'm more inclined toward your position, but I do want to play out the kind of thinking through consent. So one is his reliance on Cicero. I just did look back at that passage in him talking about what is a commonwealth, and he does say that it's people who, by consent to the law, are governed together. And so I wondered how we address that. And then the second part would be about participation. So it seems like in one sense participation is an alternative to consent, but in another sense the point is that it is necessary for the common good, that those who are governed participate in some way. And so while it may not be strictly speaking necessary that the authority first has consent as an original act, it would be bad government to fail to seek it out. And that we can see this, anyone who's ever had to rule anybody, parents ruling their children, realizing, yes, I could just tell my kids, you do these things or else. But generally that would be bad for their formation, that as they get older, I really try to find ways to help them see why it is good to obey this law or this decision. And so that consent is at the heart for Aquinas, especially, again, given when people become cognizant of the desire to be free to rule themselves, that unless the authority makes sincere efforts to include them in the decision-making process, it will hinder their formation as virtuous individuals and also undermine peace. So maybe it's a prudential argument, I guess, and not so much a metaphysical or anthropological argument. So, yeah, just I hear like your thoughts on that.
So I think on the participation front, I mean, I guess I have a bunch of thoughts I'm trying to pull together. But one thing I want to say before I lose it is I think we're terrified of giving it to a certain extent Aquinas' due. And by that I mean Aquinas, so you said as they come to reason, we want them to participate more and do this themselves. Okay, fair enough. But Aquinas thinks that obedience, the actual surrendering of my will, the actual me saying, you know what? No, I'm going to give myself fully to somebody else who can take and command me. And Ignatius actually has in one of his letters this, it's a 4-page long reflection on the absolute importance for the community of Jesuits to understand how important this virtue of obedience is. So while I want to say on the one hand, yeah, I think you're on to something. There is this part where participation is a necessary element. Otherwise, like, how is the act mine? On the other hand, and I don't want to lose sight of this, because partly what I want to push back on someone like Mark Murphy for is it's very hard to step out of ourselves and see that something might actually be different and maybe we don't have it right. Now, I'm not saying necessarily that, you know, this would be easy to do. I can't imagine as a Canadian, you know, a situation in which I thought, hey, I want my prime minister to have final say over everything I do. I can imagine a whole lot of situations where that is not the case, in fact. But, I mean, just odd things about the Summa, right? Aquinas could have, I mean, it would have been even longer work. But he could have asked for every virtue if it's the greatest, the most important. But he doesn't. Oddly enough, he does with obedience. It really was fundamentally, I mean, he took a vow, obviously, so it plays a role anyways. But I do worry that when we focus so much on consent, we are shaped by the early modern period. There's no doubt about that. And it's hard for us to step outside of ourselves and imagine a world where we conceive of ourselves primarily as parts. I mean, there are passages in the Summa where you're reading, and Aquinas talks about a human being as primarily a part of the common good. So it's, and in that case, you know, I do want to make sure that, like, I didn't mean to put the common good down. I just meant reason. How do we know what the good is without reason? So reason's got to be first when we're mapping out the law. But so I think the question is great, and I don't have a simple answer. I just know that part of the project I'm pursuing is trying to push back and leave a little conceptual space for a different understanding of what a political community could be. Now, do I think we have political communities today that instantiate that? No. I just don't think we do. Now, I don't know what they would be. I don't know if we've got to retreat to the monasteries to have that. I hope not. But I don't think that large federated states lend themselves to those types of smaller communities that I think Aquinas had in mind.
I'll call the other lady in the room now.
I had a question for Jimmy, and I think my question is, why did Norris Clark see the need for a new concept, and particularly why would he choose a word like system that seems so impersonal when you say it? At least like that's the connotation for me. When people have opted for more traditional terms like societas or comunitas, because for me, like, you could use the concept of community and communication and common good to explain both the motive cause for why we need community. Like, the common good functions as a motive cause. It's because we all desire something and we're willing to work for it in common that communities exist. And then it's that same end that also puts the downward pressure on the community, because we're willing to, in some sense, subjugate ourselves to the community for the sake of this common good that we can only achieve together, and through which we, like, it's also the only means to find our own personal flourishing. So I guess if you can kind of explain social structures that way, why the need for a newer, more modern, more impersonal sounding language?
Yes, that's a very good question. I don't have a full answer for that. I can tell you what Clark says when he proposes the notion of system. He doesn't refer only to, I would say, social structures per se. Actually, he doesn't mention social structures. Really, it's me interpreting him. But he mentions things like, let's say, colonies of insects. He mentions things as fields of force in physics. He mentioned things such as, there's something else, ecological systems and things like that, that actually are these particular communities you want that are gathered together or put together because of accidents that kind of reside in their substances that are part of. And this accidental, if you want, link is more than only connected with individuals, but create some kind of greater network if you want. And so he doesn't make a distinction between, I would say, personal and impersonal substances, if you want to talk about that way, in that regard. And that's what he calls it, or considers it, that it would be a good idea in his mind to have this new kind of new accident being created, right? As per the second part of your question, I don't know if I am really misunderstanding what you say, but one of the things that social structures are noted by is that they are based on many instances on tacit knowledge we have. So I don't know if it has happened to you. It has happened to me every time there's a party when my boss is present at work. I do not act as if I were without my boss present, because it's evidently there's a power game, right, happening. And I do not think about that really too much. It happens, I perceive it, and that actually puts pressure on me to behave in certain ways and not in others. So I am not sure if that actually fits with the categories you're mentioning, because it's a blurry kind of perception I have, right? So it's not as the same as I would say the public deliberation we may have about the common good and how we can achieve it. You can even formalize all that, right? The social structures are in many ways, many of them are informal, right? So that would be my only comment on that. But I like the notions you put forward as alternative for sure. I like them better than the system. Yeah, I might think that they might be better for my current purposes in my own research than the one I'm using. But I don't know exactly how to work with them. I need to think more about. But thank you very much for that.
I'll go over here.
Thank you very much. This question's for Dr. Ferry. So first off, just thank you for that very helpful way of mapping out the source of the way authority comes from God versus the way that who rules comes from God. That was, I think that's very helpful for me. So I think I agree completely with your project. This is just a sort of nitpicky question that I don't think affects where you were going. But like you criticized Mark Murphy in part for tracing authority to the jus gentium, if I remember correctly. And right, and so I wonder whether you could say, I mean, as you said, jus gentium is a bit of a cat's cradle. And it's a little hard to pin down exactly what Aquinas means, but it seems like you could say it is human in a way in which, right, it's human in a way in which the straight up natural law is not, right, even though it's got aspects of the natural law. And arguably what characterizes it could be that it's not something that we are directly inclined towards, it's not a good in itself, but it's something which is a universally necessary means for something which is in fact good, right? So the way Aquinas' stock example is private property, right? So private property is not good in itself, but right, something that you need in order to get this stuff that's good in itself. So couldn't we agree with Mark Murphy at least about this much, that authority is good not because authority in itself is intrinsically awesome, but because it's something that we need in order to do the thing which is intrinsically awesome, which would be joint action towards a common good or something like that. That would be my question.
So I guess my answer to it is going to be just as nitpicky. Sorry. But I'm not sure, like I'd have to think about it a little bit more to give you an honest answer and a more fulsome answer. But I think in a way what I want to say is even if that's true, it doesn't matter to the case I'm building in the sense that what I'm faulting him with doing is trying to pull the jus gentium in as a backstop, like a way to get, custom in so that we can actually come up with a way of having consent. I mean, this model of consent, by the way, wouldn't make anybody happy. I can't imagine John Simmons saying, "Oh, wow, problem solved. Here's the transactional act. It's an act of the community." Like, it just would never work anyways. But so I have a very narrow concern with his use of that, just in the nature of the argument that he put together. Otherwise, yeah, I mean, like I said, I think I'd have to think about it a little bit more, but perhaps aren't we then at most still saying something partial and not about the ground? So all I'm concerned with is, where does the ground come from? And there I want to say, look, it's straight natural law for Aquinas. It's part of the moral order, and that's why we're subject to it. And I want that sharp sort of demarcation because I don't want, in this case, for it to be cloudy in any way. So if your argument leads me down a cloudy path, I want to say, nope, not going to go there. But I'm not sure it does. I just wonder if all we get out of it is something about the distinct governing personnel and something about regime type, conversations I'm happy to have, and I think that's really what it does speak to, right? Like, what are the best types of regime? Are there problems? I mean, Messner makes a point about the natural moral order that there's nothing in it. After we ground political obligation in it, there's nothing in it to say democracy is necessarily the perfect form. Now, I think Maritain sometimes, comes close to saying, hey, this is almost the end of time, as it were, like we got to the perfect form. I don't think he believes that. I think he actually believes democratic philosophy, that there are philosophical principles, but he comes close sometimes to saying, like, we made it. This is the form, and we've got to just perfect this form. I think all we get out of the Law of Nations is reflections on regime type and virtue of rulers, or quality of rulers. That would be my sort of more fulsome, but still needs more work, answer to you.
Let's see. All right. Okay. Well, I'll just go with you, I guess.
Yeah, mine's going to be very quick. It's a nice little follow up on the last one for Len. So I was thinking more about what grounds political authority in general. Perhaps it may not be the use gentium. Why not just make it the basic goods of practical reason that Finis suggests?
Well, I mean, Finis doesn't actually do it that way. If you're thinking about the book on law, the book from the 80s, he actually focuses on coordination, right? So it's Simone's, and he admits this in the footnotes. Sorry, he admits this in the footnotes to the book. This is Simone. He's developing Simone for a wider audience, I think, trying to sort of get the legal community to realize that the notion of coordinating social problems makes authority necessary. So he's looking for necessary functions of authority. That, for Simone, is coming straight out of the natural law. So we're not actually, you know, if you're going to go to Finis as your example, then that isn't where he goes initially. And even in Aquinas, the book on Aquinas, he largely, now he's freer in that book not to try to constrain himself and make this for a wider legal audience, but in that book he's freer to be able to say, look, this is sort of the tradition, and again he'll cite Simone in the footnotes, like this is where I'm pulling this from. If I had to fault Finis, and I probably shouldn't, but if I had to, it would just be that he stops at the first of the essential functions that Simone draws attention to. He doesn't go on to the second, and I think he would totally accept the perfective function of the overall goal is for the ruler to make us all better, as much as that is humanly possible in this realm. I think he would fully accept that, but he leaves out the difference between willing materially and willing formally the common good, which Simone calls the most essential function. And it took Simone a long time, you know, from the 1940 lecture until really the philosophy of democratic government before he sorts that out. So that would be why, I think. Sorry.
Yeah. I'm sorry I can't take the last couple of questions, but I hope discussion can continue during the break. And please thank our panelists here. Thank you all for coming.